Welcome, welcome, my friends, to this casual conversation. Um, we teach poetry, the three of us, and I thought it would be really great to have some folks who are very specifically engaged in teaching poetry in different settings to have a little chat about how it goes for us and why we think it's important and what we achieve and for our students, the kids that we work with, and for ourselves in doing the work that we do. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Heidi Mordhorst. I was a classroom teacher in many different settings for 37 years. And then I had the great gift of an opportunity to change gears, leave full time classroom teaching, and establish WHISPERshout Writing Workshop. It's now a 501c3 with the mission of poetry and justice for all. And I do school day workshops and I do after school programs, usually in conjunction with PTAs. And then at the studio at my house, the WHISPERshout studio, I also offer out of school time workshops. So little spring break camps, a much more elaborate summer camp coming up. And I work with kids who are generally 4 to 12, mainly 5 to 11, elementary school age. How about you, Margaret?
Hi, I'm Margaret Simon, and I was teaching for 38 years until I retired in May of 25 and found an opportunity that has just been a godsend through our Acadiana Center for the Arts. It's called the Teaching Artist Program, and I get to go into schools and do the best part of teaching. I like to tell them I I get to come in and have fun, and I don't have to grade their papers or call their parents for any reason. So it's just a joy. I get to go into the classrooms and, you know, get passionate about poetry and it's just a joy. I've really enjoyed this new gig of mine. Oh, Joan, you're on mute.
Well, great. I'm Jone Rush MacCulloch, and I retired 8 years ago after 44 years, mostly in the school library. And I now am substituting, and I also love to bring in poetry and art when I go to the classrooms. Most of the teachers ask me, would you like me to leave you some time for poetry and art? And I always say yes. And it's one of the best things that I get to do with my retired time.
Well, thank you for joining me. We're going to address a few different questions. And the first one is what works in teaching poetry to kids? What are your favorite approaches for working with specific ages and stages of students? Just, I'll toss something out. Uh, I did not make this up. I actually heard someone say this in a Poetry Foundation workshop that I went to in Chicago one July. And when I heard the simple sentence, I didn't really even need to hear the rest of the workshop because it made immediate sense to me. It was, you can say to kids who very typically go to the art room for their art special each week, um, who likes to do art? Well, poetry is just artwork made of words. And I was like, that is genius. And that is how I begin with the youngest students and even with the oldest students at the right level. And I usually bring in an artwork that I've made, a collage, and we talk about how it was made and what the tools and materials are that I used and the choices that I made as an artist to make the artwork, the visual art. And then I show them my real artwork, the thing that I feel most passionate about. And they're like, where is it? What is it? The little ones aren't sure, right? And the older ones know that it's made of words, but they have never necessarily thought of a poem as an artwork. And that really changes the conversation about what we're doing in a classroom with this kind of literature that sits on the boundary between art and literacy and creativity and self-expression and breaking the rules and following the rules. So that's one of my go-to approaches, is to treat poetry writing like making an artwork of any other kind.
Heidi, I want to thank you for that because this is a new gig for me, and it's always I'm always curious about, okay, how do I best approach these kids who really don't experience poetry every day, and they don't really that, I usually start with what is a poem and try to elicit, um, responses that way. But I love the way you do that. So I might have to change it up. I have borrowed what you say to the kids about being the boss. You
Hmm.
are the boss of your poem. And I've
And
been
we're going to
doing,
come back around that, I think, when we talk about why poetry is important.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. How about you, Joan?
Um, yeah, I like to sometimes start with a poem that I really, really like, and I always feel that if I'm really enthusiastic about the poem, kids are going to be. And um, I think over the years, they just know that when I come in, they're going to get poetry. Because one of the things about subbing is I might teach them in kindergarten, and I'm probably going to bring in that art piece now with kinders. But I will see them again in first grade and second grade, and we'll talk about, that time that we got to do poetry. And I am pretty firm about really trying to tie in the art to the
Mhm.
visual to go along with the poem all the time.
That brings
So,
me a question for you, Joan. Do you typically sub just in one school, and is it the school where you worked?
pretty much, yes. I have been, when our district had libraries, I got to teach in different libraries, my different friends, but since most of them have gone to the classroom, I only have one or two that I sub for that have been back in the classroom. But yeah, I pretty much just limit my subbing right now to um, my one school that was my work home for 34 years. And
That's
I
really cool
am,
because
oh, go
you
ahead.
have these long-term relationships now
Right.
with
And that's
kids,
what I
right?
had when I was teaching with my gifted students. Had long, I mean, I'd have them
Yeah,
from first grade all the way through sixth grade. And they knew as soon as they walked, I mean, they always knew Poetry Friday
yeah,
was going to be Poetry Friday. So it's very different now working with students who really have very limited experience with poetry, very limited.
yeah.
And so that's been
And
a kind of a challenge.
and see, I'm hoping in this coming year to expand. I might want to pick your brain on another time, Heidi, about providing for other outside of my subbing days,
Hmm.
to provide workshops for kids to figure out how I can go out into other schools. And with my book coming out, I
Very
want to
exciting.
I've always wanted to do that, but I haven't. It's one of those things I haven't gotten to yet. So
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I have both experiences now because I work through the Maryland State Arts Council and I can write grants that allow me to go in and provide extended residencies at no cost to the school. I have these, short-lived relationships with kids. I see them 3 or 4 sessions and that's it. In some schools, I go in year after year and I see new second graders each time, but I have a long-standing relationship with the teachers and I love that second grade gig because most of the time 80% of the kids have never really heard of what a poem is and 90% of them have never written one, and so I'm the person who gets to say you are now a poet and bring in a congratulations balloon to the poetry party at the end and say what is there to congratulate you about, and then they have to sort of review all the new things that they've learned. But as well, I have these after school workshops and I go repeatedly to the same schools, my old school and a few others in the area, and I have many repeat customers and families who pass on the word about Whisper Shout workshops, and they change every time. It's not the same thing, it's not the same theme. I'm getting ready to do the spring session is going to be called Kaleidoscopic Color World. And we're going to be using, color paint chips and color wheels and prisms and kaleidoscopes and watercolors. And we're going to be reading all the many really wonderful books that focus on colors. And I'm looking forward to that. And so kids can keep coming back and doing the Whisper Shout workshop again. They always are going to get some kind of art or drama mixed in with some science and nature. And then they're also going to get poetry every time. And it's often the only place that they get to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
that's great.
do
So
we?
Would you like me to ask a question? I I would like to know, um, well, because I have pretty strong feelings about this, what makes poetry important? We seem to be rare breeds, those of us who come into the classrooms um, teaching poetry, and I, I, I can't help but be really disappointed when I ask the question, "What is a poem?" and really get very little in response. Um, it hasn't been a part of most of the kids I work with. It hasn't been a part of their learning at all. And they have a sketch of what they think it is, and
A
they
little inkling.
a little inkling, oh, it's written in stanzas, and yeah, it's written, it's sometimes, well, sometimes they just say it's rhyme, and I have to correct them. It's not always rhyme, but it's just I just feel sadness when I see kids have not been exposed to poetry, because I feel like the importance, I mean, poetry to me gives students and me a way to express ourselves that is unique. And like you said, Heidi, about that art piece, it is a piece of art, and a piece of art in words. And, yesterday a teacher was kind of trying to be flippant with me, saying, you know, well, she was being flippant with the students. She was saying, well, watch out because so and so, is going to be grading this. And I looked at her and I went, no, 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 no. I said, we don't ever grade poetry. And she said,
No.
oh, I didn't mean it, but it's
Uh-huh.
like, no,
Mm.
this is creative expression. It is not anything to be graded. So why is it important?
I think it gives kids a sense of who they are. Um, I think they, I think there's a lot of joy when they see that they have written a poem, and I know when I share um, the blogs when I publish their poems and go back and get to share, they are just so it builds that confidence.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that I love about teaching poetry is it's such a short it's it isn't lengthy. You don't have to
Mhm.
worry about
Mhm.
paragraphs. You don't have and for some of those kids where they're very resistant to writing, they can see that they can put something together that isn't all that, it's kind of a low risk. Just last week I was working with with a school, not my school, but they had a family literacy night and they asked me to do a poetry room, and I decided to set up 3 stations. I had a really low risk of come and read a poetry book with your child, and I put out some of the anthologies that I've been published in a couple of my favorite go-to poetry books. Then the more medium risk was I made these poetry cubes with phrases on them that they could just use the phrases and create basically a found poem, or they could go off of it. And then the higher risk was the haiku cubes, because you have to really sit down and they just had the best time. And I just think it gives them a sense of accomplishment. Even the ones that when I have a kid that is resistant in writing, I will scribe for them. I don't care if they, you know, tell me, okay, so tell me what you're thinking. Let me write this down because
And that's
and
because
because
you
those
can
kids,
compose a poem even if you can't write the poem.
right,
Mhm.
right. Just to show them. I mean, and I've shared those on Poetry Friday. There's been some hilarious poems because they don't want to write poetry and they don't. I'm not a poet, and yet they are.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Most kids are, and especially younger kids. And I always say, so poetry is important for a few different reasons. And I'm going to echo some of what you've both said. and add something in. So it is the perfect genre for beginners, right? Because it is short. You can say something meaningful and powerful in just a few words, and you don't have to be. It's a legitimate piece of writing, even if you don't know all the conventions of punctuation. Because, and I always say this to kids, what I love most about poetry is that you make up your own rules, right? And it's good to be introduced to the rules of certain forms, but often the way it's taught in school is here is a cinquain, here is a, and kids get the idea that it's a recipe that you follow rather than being told what Margaret mentioned, that you are the boss of your poem. I am giving you all the input I can, lots of creative opportunities. We always make the art before we write, because while you're making the art, while you're acting out the story, you're cogitating, you're generating material for what it is you're about to write. So that provides something to hang your poem on. But you, no matter what I offer you, if you don't want to write about the thing that is the theme of the workshop, you don't have to, because the whole idea is that you are the boss of your poem. And I think that this is also connected to the other reason that it's easy to shy away from doing poetry in the classroom. And that's because when you invite children to express themselves, they do. And then you're the teacher in the room sitting with information, perhaps, or emotions, or a view of a kid that you don't feel prepared necessarily to cope with. You have a ton of things on your plate. And I know, we all know, having been in classrooms and libraries for all those years, there's ever more that we are responsible for. And the idea that you would also encounter the inside of a kid that you haven't met before in your classroom because you've asked them to write and you've said, write something that's meaningful and important to you, is really scary. And I know that there are a lot of folks who, in addition to being maybe a little shy about encountering poetry themselves, like, what does it mean and how do I decide what it means? They are also reluctant to offer kids the opportunity to really be themselves on paper. There is, and they handle that sometimes by saying, here's the rubric. And your poem has to have 7 lines, and your poem has to count the syllables, and you have to. Whereas I always feel like I have been most successful as a poetry teacher, as a teaching artist, when no child's poem is anything like any other child's poem. Because that means that I gave them that confidence you mentioned, Joan, that sense that my voice matters. And that's why I chose poetry and justice for all as my mission statement, because there's justice buried in the ability of all kids to use their voices, to find their voices and use them powerfully. And if they're writing a funny poem that makes people laugh, that's just as powerful and could turn into something really great down the road, right? As writing a really heartfelt nature appreciation poem, which is the thing that in general we much prefer to see come out in the classroom. Or we might just see the raw truth of a kid's life. And I had to ask a kid the other day, she wrote something about knives in my eyes, and I cry, and I don't stop, and I don't stop. Oh, I don't stop until I cry. And I was like, let me ask this little girl a question. Are you seeing something you don't want to see? Because I was curious about why she would say that she'd stab knives in her eyes. And she said, no, that's the feeling of my anger. And I said, okay, how about this? How about we help people understand what this poem is about? And you could use anger as your title.
A title.
Right?
Yeah.
So that people understand that there's not some, I was really imagining some sensitive situation of possibly being exposed to content that she didn't really want to see. And really, it was just her own intense feeling of anger, at her brother, right? Like, the only thing I can think of to relieve this is, right, dramatic kid, great poem.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So that all is why I think poetry is important, because it gives kids agency if you offer it, if you let them have it. And you have to be prepared as the teacher, right? To accept. And I have said to kids, you've probably had this experience too. I have said to kids, that is an outstanding poem. It is, however, not school appropriate. So I want to tell you all the things that are good about this poem and why most people would not think it's okay to read this at our poetry party, but I want you to know it's a great poem, and I'm so glad you wrote it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've had to remind a couple kids that we are going to be family friendly. And I mean, especially when one of the things I love to do, and it kind of leads into, you were saying approaches, um, word banks
Mm,
and creating word banks.
Mhm.
And sometimes the word, it's a great word. Mm, Not sure it's family friendly.
Yeah.
but boy, it's really great for rhyming.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah. Oh, good.
All right. So, were we going to talk about some of our favorite? Are we on favorite
oh,
books? Go to books? Oh, I did
yeah.
want to. We could
Oh,
do
go ahead.
that, but I did want to ask, how different do you is what you do with much younger kids, and for example, Margaret, the middle schoolers that you've been working with, and I think
Yeah.
even some high school groups, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I have really run the gamut this year, and it's been a very it's been challenging to me because I am accustomed to the elementary group, and also I've been accustomed to gifted kids who kind of come in pretty ripe for
Hmm.
writing.
Hmm.
They they've got a lot of metaphorical thinking already and that kind of thing going on. And so now I'm going into regular classrooms with all different
The full range.
the full range, right? And so I have to kind of let go of some of my high expectations of what they might already know how to do, and
Mhm.
it's fine. It's fine. We create a safe space within that time that we're together, and I always incorporate art. So you know, I'm not teaching them how to draw. I'm not that kind of teaching artist, but we always include art. So when that kind of gives a way in, it's a little safer space, then
Mhm.
and anyway, it has been kind of an interesting journey. But I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed it. And some of the things that the kids have come back with have been just amazing. And like you said, when they create something that is kind of amazing, they feel it, they know it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I
Like
also
those
have,
little miracles that,
yeah.
yay.
But also, have you seen this too, where one or two kids write something that's outside the sort of the middle path, and everybody can feel that it's special, and they get inspired by their peer, and they want to go
Hmm.
and try something else, and they want to
Mhm.
take a little more risk. They want to, you know, say something truer, say something in a different
Hmm.
way. And I love when that happens because, it happens with all kinds of things. Six,
Right.
seven just careened through every classroom in the entire internet world. And, it would be really great if poetry, poetry recitation did that too. But you can see that happening in classrooms, a little contagion of poetic risk. And I love that.
One thing I did this week that was different, that I really was pleased with how it turned out, because I kind of hesitate to actually pick up another student's poem and read it. But with
Mm.
these middle schoolers, they were so like, I don't want to read this, I want
Right.
to read it out loud. And I said, okay, well, would you mind if I read it out loud? And then I turned on the performer me,
Exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah.
in reading
Hmm.
aloud their poem. And I mean, you could just feel the pride happen
Hmm.
in the
Yeah.
room because someone else was reading their poem, but I was reading it with such vigor.
Yeah.
And that
Hmm.
really gave them a real sense of pride. And I I was kind of hesitant to do that, but I'm glad I did it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think
What
I
I
think
what I have
sometimes
oh,
offering
go ahead.
I was going to say sometimes offering to read for somebody really changes the tone of
Mm.
the room and gives and go, oh, especially if
Oh,
they hear the feedback from other
mhm,
students.
Yeah.
mhm.
That's really positive.
And I have learned, being mainly an early childhood person, kindergarten, first, second grade, they all, just about all want to show off,
Want to share. Yeah,
want
they
to
all
have
want to
the
share.
attention.
Yeah.
Third grade and up, what I've learned to do is I do boss moves. I talk about, I'm gonna share from poems. Now I'm not gonna say who the poet is. If it's your poem and you want to claim it and say I wrote that publicly, you can, and then maybe you'll come and read it, with me. But I think you're right. It's so important to let them hear how their poem sounds with kind of a sensitive, dramatic, experienced performance voice, right? But
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I read them. I don't really ask permission because I'm not revealing who it is. And I say, what I
Yeah.
love about this poem is this and this and this, and this is really cool. And you might like to try this. Let's give that poet a clap. And so, without ever revealing who it was, eventually everybody knows whose poem is whose. But it's a
Mm-hmm.
way of letting older kids not expose themselves and yet
Mm-hmm.
have their work honored and appreciated, and
Mm.
the examples of peers being shared. So that was a super good tip that I learned from my friend, the sixth grade teacher, who keeps inviting me back.
I also
That is
take,
a fabulous
I
tip.
ask them if I can take a picture of it. And I
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
tell them, I say that I'm a blogger and I'll take a picture of it and I'll say that I'm going to, I'm going to
Yeah.
publish
Mm-hmm.
this. So I think,
Mm-hmm.
Joan, you do that too, right? You publish their,
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it was last week was it last week? The one of the more yeah, it was last week. I subbed in this second grade classroom that I've been in several times now this year, and we did the animal sound poems, which is one of my go-tos. And they just all wanted to read. They came,
Yeah.
can we read our poems? Can we? Yes, you can. I love
yeah.
that. They were
Yeah,
very excited.
I think Joan, I'm going to steal that for next. See, I as a teaching artist, you have to create like your workshops that
Right.
they're gonna post on
Hmm.
the website. So I think I'm going to put that up as a
It
as
is a
one for
winner.
next year, and I think it will go really well with my new
Hmm.
baby board book that is about the sounds
Yeah,
of birds on the
Yeah.
bayou, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I
yeah.
Yeah.
mean it's full of onomatopoeia. So we can just
Hmm.
make all of us can make onomatopoeia poems, I
And
love
and
saying the word.
one of the things I've been doing with been playing around with the word bank is because I provide a lot of scaffolding for their poetry to
Mhm.
start, but instead of asking them, well, colors for the animals, I have started using the color of. And in the fourth grade class that I was in a couple weeks ago, I said, okay, so the color of. I said, how can we say if something is brown, how can we say it's brown without saying it's brown?
Well, now
With the
you're
second grade, they
scaffolding
came
the,
up with
the simile
trees
and
and
the metaphor, right?
and it's
Mhm.
and then you're not saying, oh, now we're going to write a metaphor, and
No, you just
I'm
yeah,
gonna
guiding them there.
I'm going in to fourth grade tomorrow, and I'm going to try it also with. So give me some moves. It moves like what, you know?
Yeah,
Mhm.
And I think it's such a great. It's like this aha for me. Like, oh,
Mhm.
this is so
oh
much better than tell me how it moves. So
yeah, that's
yeah,
a great idea. Thank you
Yeah.
for
yeah.
that.
Yeah. Well,
So
that's
and
a
it's
pretty good
that
segue into books, but go ahead, Jen. I come back around to, how does creating with young poets sustain and inspire you?
I am constantly looking at how to revise lessons. I mean, they just provide the energy. They see things in a different way than I would have ever seen it. I love when they don't follow the rules. You know, I love, it was so interesting. I think I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the blog um, for tomorrow. Um, so in the animal poems, I have them to kind of talk about rhythm, the animal sounds, repeat the animal sounds. And I had a student, and I said, you can play with. It doesn't have to be the same three sounds. You can play with them, and they had them going like MEO W, MEO-W. So they, And I just thought, this is brilliant. I would have never thought of that, just to indicate how you should be saying it, and it should be different. Or they would switch the words. And I thought, this is what I love. I love seeing how their little minds work and their big
Mhm.
minds
All
work.
they need is permission.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that Sandy Line said, he was a mentor of mine. He's since passed away, but he would say that the best poets are the ones who give themselves the most permission.
Mhm.
And I've always remembered that. And I think the kids, being with kids and writing poems alongside them and watching them respond and really be very proud of what they've accomplished is sustaining. I mean, it's what I'm here
Mm-hmm.
for, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really the
Mm-hmm.
best part of teaching for me. And I'm just happy I get to still do it, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to write an IEP so that I can write, you know. No,
To justify it, right?
yeah, or a lesson plan, or yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you're right. And I'm not really competing with any other teachers or anything. I mean, it's really the best of the
Mm-hmm.
teaching
I would
world. In
agree.
fact, I go into classrooms and the teachers themselves are just going, "Oh, I wish I could retire and teach poetry all the time."
Mm-hmm.
I think most of us have something that we feel especially passionate about. But my the inspiration and the sustenance are kind of the same for me. It is I'm wearing my my watering can earrings. And I've also spoken about myself as, a midwife to poems. And I feel like my
Mm-hmm.
job is to make way for kids to find their voice and then use it
Mm-hmm.
powerfully as possible. And, if I'm teaching some technique about how to do that along the way, that's great. But really I see you, you are important, what you have to say is important, and then they do. And that
Hmm.
is inspiring to me because, like you said, Joan, I get so many ideas. Back when I could remember verbatim what kids said in the classroom, I would go home and write poems about them. My brain will not do that for me anymore. So
No.
I use my phone a lot to take pictures of
Mm-hmm.
that. So I get inspired by the things that kids say, what they write, how they see the world, but also it is a reminder every day of why we would bother to save the world, right? It's for them.
Right.
It's for it that they are the inspiration.
Hmm.
I'm getting relief from the outside world by being in the moment with kids,
Hmm.
and then also I'm getting reminded why it's important to pay attention to the outside world. And that is a combination which, in addition to just the joy of what they come up with and getting to do what I want without a lot of the stuff that I don't want, it makes my current job the best job I've ever had.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
here, here.
Yeah.
Yes. It is.
We're so lucky. Look at us.
Mm-hmm.
Three
Yes.
lucky white ladies.
Yes. It is a privilege. I'll tell you, we were very, I feel that more and more every day
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and to bring joy I hope to always be bringing joy because
Right.
there's not enough of it in the world.
And I do
Yeah.
think it keeps us young.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I agree. I would totally agree.
All
Thank you,
right.
Heidi, for doing this.